Okay, shall I start? Yes. Welcome to this second webinar on Korean population challenges. Today's title is Challenge Amid Success in South Korea. And this is the second webinar on this program. And the situation is that Koreans are an amazing people. For good or bad, they seem like a microcosm of the features of the world. South Korea leads Asia in the very desirable realms of prosperity and the culture of youth, financial success, upward mobility. But paradoxically, despair leads as well. Its suicide rate tops all in the OECD group of nations, Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, and is a leading cause of death among Koreans 10 to 24-year-olds. The Republic hosts more abortions than any other nation on earth. It also has the lowest birth rate in the world, as the marriage rate among the young and successful continue to plummet, all celebrated by a big alcohol consumption. Well, to deal with this issue, the program host, the International Association of Academicians for Peace, IAAP, is a global interdisciplinary academic project initiated by the Universal Peace Federation co-founder Dr. Hak Jae-han Moon. And IAAP calls on the intellectual power of academicians to contribute toward lasting global peace and affirms that academicians, scholars, and educators have enriched and continue to strengthen essential human intellectual, moral, and spiritual developments towards a good society. So we build professional networks and aim to foster peace beyond borders based on the admirable goals of interdependence, mutual prosperity, and universal values. So today, our expert panel searches for causes and solutions to the crisis amid the glam, K-pop, and commercial success in South Korea. Our first panelist is Mr. Lyman Stone, and he is an eminent scholar in this area. He's a director of research for the consulting firm Demographic Intelligence, and he works as a research fellow at the Institute for Family Studies, is a senior fellow at Cardus, and a PhD student at McGill University. He previously worked for the American Enterprise Institute, U.S. Foreign Agriculture Service, and the Tax Foundation. His writings they're all over the internet. He appeared in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, Atlantic, South China Morning Post, and many, many other publications. And Lyman's research explores the links between family, fertility attitudes, public policy, and demographic outcomes. He, his wife, and two daughters live in Montreal, Quebec, and he is piping in from the nice nation of Canada to join us today. So, Mr. Lyman Stone, the floor is yours.
Thank you. It's good to be with you today, to have the chance to join you to talk about some of these things. Thank you to the hosting organizations, the IAAP, and I believe UPF. I get all my abbreviations mixed up, but thank you so much for inviting me. It's really a pleasure to be with you. I'll share my screen here for my my presentation. So that you can see what I'm seeing. Okay. So the prompt I was given to talk about was to talk about the link between values and attitudes, cultural values, and fertility rates. To basically ask, what's the role that culture and values play in motivating fertility decisions? So my presentation is called Why Have Babies? The link between cultural values and fertility rates. And what I want to do is I just want to walk you through kind of at a high level, not in too many of the weeds, though I'm happy to get into it in the Q&A. I think we should have plenty of time for Q&A, but at a high level, walk you through some of the kinds of cultural things that might influence fertility and fertility desires. So we'll start with the obvious. I think pretty much everybody knows, either formally or intuitively, that there is a link between gender attitudes and family size desires. People who have more sort of traditional, hierarchical, non-egalitarian gender attitudes tend to desire to have bigger families. People who have more progressive, modern, liberal, egalitarian, individualist gender attitudes tend to desire smaller families. This data that I'm showing you right here comes from the 2018 Korean General Social Survey. So this is reflecting Korea as up to date as we have data for. Basically, on the left, we have the people who say that women must have children to have a full life. If they agree with that statement, on average, they plan to have about 2 children. Whereas on the other hand, those who say that women do not have to have children to have a full life, on average, plan to have about 1.5 children. Now, you'll recall the current fertility rate in Korea is about 0.8 or 0.9. So these plans for both groups are far higher than what we see in reality. Now, I should say, if instead of using plans, I used actual babies born, you would see the same correlation. But it has a bias by age. So I use plans to avoid our kind of age bias, because as people get older, they tend to have more kids because they've had more time to have kids, right? But this same thing shows up if we use actual childbearing, just at a lower level and with a bit more complexity. So gender attitudes matter. Now, there's some research that suggests that as a society on the whole becomes extremely egalitarian, that some of this negative effect of more progressive gender attitudes might dissipate. That's still debated, but it goes under the heading of feminism is the new natalism. And there's been some experimentation with this in countries like Korea and Japan, where a lot of the current wave of pronatal policy has been oriented at trying to get men to take more responsibility at home, take more paternity leave, and all these things to try and accelerate the transition to sort of like ultra egalitarian Nordic gender attitudes. Now, we can talk more about this in the Q&A. I'm pretty skeptical that this works, but the point is it's an aggregate thing. At the individual level, no one disputes that individuals who have more egalitarian values desire to have fewer children. Next up is something that's a little bit less obvious, but it might still make sense to people, and that is cohabitation. People who think that it's okay to cohabit, that's the blue bar, desire to have fewer children. They plan to have fewer children. This is, again, the 2018 GSS wave, about 1.4. Whereas people who think it's not okay to cohabit desire to have or plan to have slightly more children, around 1.9. Now, it seems obvious to us that people who say children are important for a satisfying life would want to have more kids because, of course, they've just revealed to us that they want to have kids. Cohabitation is a little bit different, right? This is not necessarily about kids, right? So this is saying, oh, it's not just gender norms. There's broader family norms turn out to matter. So it isn't just attitudes towards children themselves that influences fertility and fertility plans, but family attitudes generally seem to matter. And then we get to a surprising one. When we think about traditional values, one of the things that people sometimes think of as a traditional value, or something that it used to be people thought this way, is that work is really important. Hard work is important. You should have a job, do hard work for yourself. We associate this with, like manual labor on the farm, all these traditional things. So me and a co-author a few years back did a study where we merged survey data from a bunch of different survey programs from dozens of countries, hundreds of thousands of survey respondents. And we looked at how attitudes towards work influenced fertility. And we looked at the importance people assigned to family and the importance people assigned to work. And what we found is that as people became more workist, so as they moved right on this graph, that is, they prioritized work more highly relative to family, fertility fell. That is, valuing family more does predict higher fertility. But even for people who value family at a given level, valuing work more predicts lower fertility in high-income countries. This is not true in low-income countries, but in high-income countries, both for men and for women, you can see the blue line here is men. And again, as you go to the right, you're getting more work-focused, and the vertical axis is the number of children ever born to these respondents, so their personal fertility. What we found is that for both men and for women, as people came to value work very highly, as they came to derive a lot of their meaning in life from work, their fertility fell. Now, my first two slides were pretty friendly, I think, for a lot of what we could think of as social conservatives, right? Oh, it's changing gender attitudes, changing marital behaviors. These things really matter for fertility. This one is not quite as friendly for conservatives, who tend to talk a lot about the importance of work, the value of work, that people need dignified and important work, that we need to get a lot of people in employment, not have people dependent on the system. In fact, that kind of work focus is probably not good for fertility. So what's happening here? Well, what we really want to ask is, why have kids at all? Now, this data is not from Korea. This data is from a survey that I ran in the US, and there's a lot going on here. But this is showing the share of people. I gave them a list of reasons to ask, is this reason important for you when you think about reasons to have kids, or why you want to have kids? And they could either agree or disagree that it was important. And this is the share who agreed. So you can see the reasons that were most popular for American women, at least, in terms of why they wanted to have kids, were here on the left: children bring happiness and joy into the world. So children, are a source of happiness. Having kids gives your life a sense of purpose, there on the right. And having kids challenges you to grow as a person and learn new things. These were the biggest reasons people gave for why they wanted to have children. They wanted to have children because having children makes them happy. They wanted to have children because having children gives them a purpose. And they wanted to have children because having children helps them grow. Do you see what this is all about? People have children for themselves. The reasons people actually give for having children is for themselves. There are other options here. Having children is a person's duty, or I want to leave a legacy in the world, or I want my family lineage to continue to the next generation, or human life is good, so making more humans is a good thing. These responses did not get nearly as much agreement. By and large, in modern industrialized liberal societies, people have children for themselves because of the meaning it gives to them. Which means if there are other things in life that give them meaning, if there are other things in life that fill that "who am I" question, who am I? I am a successful person in my career. Who am I? I am an artist. Who am I? I am I'm a digital nomad, whatever, whatever these "who am I," if the answer to "who am I" is not I am a son, a daughter, a parent, if it's not familistic, fertility will tend to fall. And I can tell you, people who give these reasons are more common, but they're also negative. That is, people who give these individualistic reasons for why they want to have kids tend to desire to have fewer children, right? So these are common reasons, but people who resist these common reasons tend to have more babies. So the common reasons are not necessarily effective motivators for having lots of children. So why has fertility fallen? Because culture has changed, because the kinds of things that give people identity have changed. Broadly speaking, if people have attitudes which deprioritize the importance of kinship and family, fertility will fall. And it doesn't really matter what those other attitudes are. They could be an attitude that you really want to maintain a lot of leisure time, that life is about leisure and recreation. And if that attitude, that life is about your hobbies and fun stuff, if that's your attitude, family will suffer. At the same time, if your attitude that life is about success and advancement and producing things of value to others and contributing in your work, family will suffer. Self-actualization, family will suffer. And this is one we sometimes don't think about: religion. Religion can often be pronatal, particularly the Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. We find that people who are more committed to these religions have higher fertility. Most research suggests that Buddhism is not associated with higher fertility. So people more committed to Buddhism do not have higher fertility. But religion could reduce fertility if devotion to that religion does not encourage family life. And so actually, Buddhism is one of the classic cases of this, that individuals with more active Buddhist practice tend to have fewer children. But you could also think of something like monks and nuns in medieval Europe. Becoming a monk or a nun, you're not going to have as many children. Perhaps not any. So even things we classically think of as pronatal can compete with the family. So then we have to ask, can culture change? Now, this graph is from that same study on work attitudes. And here what we did is we looked at country level changes in work attitudes. Okay. And what we found is that when work attitudes change at high development levels, so the bottom axis here is the Human Development Index. So on the right these are highly developed countries like Korea. When workism increases in those countries, fertility falls. Okay. But my point in this is not to say, oh, so you're doomed. It's to say that not only can cultures change, they do change. We observe cultural change all the time in the types of data that I study. In this case, we observe that a lot of countries are becoming more work focused. They're becoming richer, and as they become richer, they're also becoming more work focused. And that work focus is reducing fertility. So cultures do change. They change a lot in various ways. The question, of course, is can they change in a way that is pro-family, right? It's trivial to say cultures change. Of course they do. We see that all the time. They change in ways that are not always beneficial for family life. So here I have fertility rates in two countries, Korea in blue and Georgia, the former Soviet country of Georgia, in red. You can see in the 80s and early 90s, the two countries had, in the 70s, they had approximately similar fertility. Korea had a more dramatic fall, but from a higher level. Georgia's fertility transition came a bit earlier. But in recent years, they've had a big divergence. Georgia's fertility rates have risen. Korea's have fallen. What happened? Well, what happened in Georgia is that a very popular religious leader of the church that claims about 90% of the population, 80 to 90% of the population, felt that abortion rates were too high and birth rates were too low, and that there weren't going to be enough Georgians in the future. And so he offered to personally baptize any third or higher born child of a married Georgian Orthodox couple. For a variety of reasons, this offer was very attractive to a lot of Georgian people for a variety of sort of historical and ideological reasons. Birth rates, and particularly of third and higher kids, third, fourth, and fifth born children, rocketed upwards immediately. 9 months after the announcement, they start to jump. among married Georgian Orthodox women. So the share of babies that were born to married mothers fell, the rate of abortion, or that were born to unmarried mothers fell, the rate of abortions fell, the fertility rate rose, driven by higher parity births. And it was disproportionately among Georgian Orthodox people who in the past had lower fertility than their Muslim neighbors. But today in Georgia, Georgian Orthodox women have similar fertility as their Muslim neighbors. In fact, they've higher than a lot of the nearby Muslim countries. So cultures can change. They can change in pro-family ways. They can change in response to the intentional efforts of cultural actors to change them. That doesn't mean they can change any way we want them to. Georgia is a unique case. There was a very popular leader of a church that a huge share of the population belonged to, that had a specific set of ideologies that made pronatal practices easier to justify. In countries where the religious environment is more decentralized, or where religious practice is not as high, or where the religion is not traditionally very pronatal, a religious intervention wouldn't work. You'd need something else. So, for example, you would need a baby boom among popular K-pop band members. I know that sounds silly, right? But there's extensive evidence that role models in popular media outlets influence fertility. We have good examples from TV shows in the US, Brazil, Pakistan, and Indonesia that have all been studied that show that lifestyle role modeling in popular media influences fertility. As it is, most K-pop stars finish their career once they want to, have a committed relationship and marry. Then their career's done. It stops then, because they're no longer a heartthrob that everyone can be like ooh and ah after because they're taken. Which means that Korea systematically creates icons who are familyless. It creates a culture where popularity and social clout is synonymous with single childlessness. So I'm not joking when I say that if you want Korea's fertility rate to rise, make it illegal to perform music for money if you don't have children. Now, that's a ridiculous proposal, but quite frankly, social icons, social role modeling, social example matters. It influences behavior in deep and compelling ways. And it's also, while changing it may impact some liberty interests, it's maybe not very fair to some of these aspiring musicians, and it might, in fact, negatively impact some of Korea's vaunted cultural exports. But it is probably cheaper than what Korea would have to do to raise birth rates by throwing money at the problem. The tax burden that Koreans will have to bear to solve low birth rates through tax incentives will also create liberty concerns, let's say. So I'm going to cap it off there to leave time for my other presenter and plenty of time for questions. But that is, I'll leave it at that and hope that that we have some good discussion afterwards.
Whoa, thank you very much. That was really wonderful presentation. I appreciate that. That data I have not really seen before. I need to follow you more closely maybe and pick it up. But thank you for putting it together for this presentation. And for all of you who are keen on even find out more, don't hesitate to write your questions in the chat box, and we'll get to them after our second presenter. And our presenter next one is Conan Park. And she is a Korean. She was born in Jeonju in Korea, attended school there, graduated from Jeonbuk National University with a bachelor's in molecular biology, and then got a master's in the same topic in 1999 for Jeonbuk University. So she was blessed in marriage in 2000 in Korea. Her husband, Richard Park, moved to the US in 2001, have 4 children, beautiful children. And she says, when my 3rd child started kindergarten in 2010, she went back to working in her career. She is working at Yale, initially at the Department of Immunobiology. And since 2018, she's doing research on skin cancer at the Yale Cancer Center in the Department of Dermatology. And she can give maybe a human flavor to this Korean experience. And I am so pleased to have our dear, I would say, sister, Conan Park, to join us today. So please unmute yourself and share a little bit of your experience from the ground, as we may say.
Thank you very much, Dr. Berg, for your kind and generous introduction. Hi, everyone. My name is Conan Park. I live in Cheshire, Connecticut. Before start, I want to inform you that I'm not a sociologist or an expert in population studies. I work as a lab manager in a laboratory that studies immunology and cancer. So when I was invited by Dr. Berg to talk about the current population decline and the low birth rate in Korea, I kindly declined at first because it wasn't really my area of expertise. But Dr. Berg said, in addition to the professional presentations by scholars and experts, he was looking for a native Korean who can share some testimonies of personal experiences that are relevant to these topics. And I thought that I may be able to share a little bit of my life experiences and what I've heard and seen from people around me who I have a close relationship with. Family is very important in Korea even today, but Korean society has changed since I was young. Decades ago, family and relatives were so close, and I think many people wanted to have big families with many brothers and sisters, cousins and uncles and aunts. Actually, sometimes I was able to see they all live together in a house, in the same house. I think having many children was seen as a good thing. I was born to a big family in the 1970s. My earliest memory about population issues was when I was young. Every night, all of my family sat together in front of the small screen of TV to watch 9 o'clock news. Before the 9 o'clock news start, I remember a big advertisement came on. That was a quite big campaign about birth control, with a narrator in it keep saying a slogan, "Let's have 2 children and raise them well." Not long later, the slogan was changed to "Give birth to 1 and live young." They also mentioned population explosion. I thought maybe the message was to have a smaller family, but as a little girl, I couldn't really imagine what the reason was. I didn't really think about it much for years. But a couple of years ago, I read a Korean news article about decreasing population in Korea. It said average divorce rate is above 50%, and the birth rate per couple is less than 1. I thought that Korean society has changed so much. When I was young, divorce was unimaginable. and people wanted big families. I have two classmates in Korea who are my friends. We were friends through high school, college, and graduate school. They are in my age, that is late 40s. They all became scientists and have professions in good companies and universities in similar area of mine. It is not easy for women in Korea to be so successful in a career, but they were able to do it. But they all didn't marry yet. They said in their 20s, they really wanted to and tried to get to marry someone. But at the same time, they wanted to focus on making accomplishment on their careers. Years ago, getting married was so important to a young woman's life. I think they made it in their careers. They found a good positions of employment and have been carrying out stable jobs in their field. I found commonalities among what they said about their personal life. They all believe that their golden time for marriage has passed in their 20s and 30s. They said they don't have complaints. Actually, they are feeling comfortable to live as unmarried, although they are not against marriage. Maybe this shows how many young women in Korea are now. Another thing I want to share is from my family members. Since I came from a big family, I have many nieces and nephews. My sisters have married decades ago, but very few of my nieces and nephews. Some of them are in their 30s, and one just became 40. They all live in Korea, and most didn't marry yet. I was able to get a chance to ask them about this issue one day. They said they feel insecure about marriage, especially the financial burden of a family. They feel pressure about how they are supposed to keep marriage alive and to raise children at this social environment. Since Korea is getting wealthier, people want to make a good level of family status and social life. And once they married, they want to give their children a high level of education as much as possible, which financially costs immensely currently in Korea. Especially the extremely high passion for educating children in the society makes the younger generation feel hesitant and push their marriage aside or behind. They are not against marriage either, but it feels to them like it has many new difficulties. Finishing my testimonies, I would like to add my personal opinion. For my husband and me, we've always wanted a big family with many children. My family and children are so precious to my husband and me. Sometimes it is very difficult to raise children, and sometimes very sad and hard. Sometimes I can't imagine things that happen. But marriage and having children is so important to me and brings me such love and happiness. My job cannot bring me that kind of happiness. I think many young people in Korea understand the financial and social difficulties of having a family and children, which is on their minds, but they don't know yet how happy experience having a husband and children is, even when it's difficult. As one of Family Federation members, I think it is important in our movement to share and show importance of God-centered family to young people to learn about love. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for those, for those points. I really appreciate the love you have for your children, and especially the point that you can get so much more joy from your children as another quality of joy that work and career has failed to provide for you. And that's something that has to be experienced to be understood. You know what you have, but you don't know what you don't have. So it's like Plato's famous cave here. Anyway, now we're going to go over to the discussion segment of this little webinar here. And I'm going to invite Mr. Stone and also our UPF chairman of North America, Dr. Michael Jenkins, to come on and host it for us. But I would just want to give a kickoff here with the person who first put the question into the chat as a reward. And that is, how about men having children to have a full life? It was the first question. So just to kick off with that one, and we have many, many more to come here. So maybe that's Mr. Stone. Is that something you have?
Sure, yeah. So it's a great question. Surveys don't ask that question. And the reason they ask this question is not because survey designers think women need to have kids to have a full life, but because this is a belief that is common in a lot of societies around the world. And so they're measuring social change. So I would love to see a symmetrical question be asked. I think that would be fascinating and really, really, it should be asked, but to my knowledge, it hasn't been, because the main interest in this question is not, the reason this question gets asked is not because sociologists actually care what people think. It's because it's seen as a way, as a barometer of social and cultural change, whereas men need to have children to have a full life. Like, what is the social change you're measuring by asking that question? It's a bit more ambiguous, so it doesn't make the cut for a survey.
Yeah, that we can discuss that topic much more, but before we get too deep, as you say, in the weeds, let's hand it over to Dr. Jenkins, and he is my guide here, and I am so impressed by him. He's been on so many webinars and programs about Korea and about issues in the world. So Dr. Jenkins, thank you for being here and spending the time with us. Please take it away. You need to unmute, I think.
No, we're not getting audio from you.
Okay.
How about now?
Now it's better.
Good.
Yes.
Thank you. I'm sorry. Thank you, Stefan, for this wonderful program. This is the second program we've done with the International Association of Academicians for Peace, and we have great scholars here. Ms. Conan Park, Professor Park, researcher and renowned person working in the medical field on skin cancer. And really, I think your insights are extremely important as a person who grew up in Korea. And also, Mr. Lyman Stone, you're renowned throughout the world for your work in this area of the birth rate. And we have a couple questions, and it's going to be open discussion. Our audience has put some questions in the chat. We have some others coming in. One is that, Mr. Stone, is there a recognized tipping point of a percentage drop in childbirth rates from which a country cannot recover? And the second part is, what is the timeline? That is, how long must the low child birth rate continue before it reaches a point beyond which a nation cannot recover?
Those are great questions. So the thing to keep in mind is that when we talk about low birth rates, we are in the infancy of this social phenomenon. Countries have not had low birth rates for a long time. That is, the countries that have had low birth rates for the longest periods of time, they've only been below 2 for maybe 60 or 70 years, 80 years. So like 3 generations. We don't know what will happen over the next 300 years. There is a lot of theoretical debate about this. Some people argue that fertility cannot stay low because in time, high fertility subgroups will multiply and spread their norms. So you can think of something like the Amish in the US for that. Others would argue that this will not happen. There's a lot of debate about this. Some of the debate revolves around how likely you think it is that the future will be characterized by a large amount of warfare. So if you believe that military technology is advanced in a way that countries will not engage in, we could say, wars of population, that is, they will not attempt to exterminate neighboring people groups, then fertility is more likely to stay low. But if you believe that in the future, warfare between countries for the purpose of gaining land for their ethnic group is likely to continue to occur as it has in the past, then fertility rates are less likely to stay low. So the more violent you believe the future will be, the more likely it is that high fertility rates would tend to be emergent and competitive. Because one of the ways that a high fertility group could expand through a society is to conquer, essentially. And this is historically what happened. So we don't know is the simple question. We don't know if it's even possible for a country like Korea to come back from where it is. There's a lot of debate on that matter, and we don't have a lot of precedents. I pointed to Georgia because Georgia is the most successful example. They had the biggest jump from a low fertility level of any country we've ever observed. No other country has made a jump that big, dramatic. So that's why I highlight it, because they're kind of an example of the most we've ever seen. And they went from about 1.5 children per woman to 2.2 in the space of about 2 years. So that's about 0.7 children added. That would put Korea from today at 0.8 or 0.9 at 1.5 or 1.6 children each, which is still a rate where Korea's population would be in terminal decline. So Korea needs to have a bigger increase than we have ever observed for any country.
It was fascinating, Lyman, when you shared that people who are popular advocating family and showing that pathway can have a big impact. We're very interested in that because that makes it possible to do something about this. But what has the governments of any country that had a lower rate and have done to increase the birth rate? Has any government successfully increased the birth rate that you know of? And then we'll go to Ms. Pak for a question.
Yeah, I mean, Georgia is your paradigmatic example of a success. But there's a nice paper.
Was that a government action? It sounded like it was really,
depends on how you think of it.
Priest.
It was the head of the Georgian Orthodox Church. The Georgian Orthodox Church does have a special constitutional status. Okay. And the same guy is in the process of attempting to institute a constitutional monarchy in Georgia. So the church state lines in Georgia are a bit blurry.
So that's kind of a government action in a sense.
It was centralized enough that I'm working on a paper on it with some co-authors, and we're treating it as a policy intervention comparable to a national policy. But other than that, examples we look at, a classic one is France. France has one of the highest fertility rates in Europe. And it's largely because France has had some of the most generous and pro-family policies over the last century. A wide range of policies. Very important. There's a paper that was published a year or two ago that looked at 50 or 60 different pronatal interventions, and they found that most of them worked. That when you throw money at the problem, birth rates do rise. They just don't rise a lot. They rise a little bit. They don't rise as much as some policymakers would like them to rise. So fertility does respond to incentives, but there's a limit on how much it responds to incentives.
Thank you. Ms. Pak, it seems like most people that I've read about in Korea are interested to live in the area around Seoul, where there's the most jobs, most opportunity, and the highest population. But that tends to make it more difficult to want to have children, because I do have Korean friends myself who say it's very hard for families now, and the crowded, and especially the expensive housing right now. Why are people wanting to move to the more difficult areas to live with a family?
So 1/4, the quarter of whole population live in Seoul. And I think that is there is a saying expression that if we give birth to a child, send it to Seoul, and then the horse, give birth to a horse, send it to Jeju Island. So that is since long ago, that people regarded the education is the most precious thing they can give to their children, and they have the education systems are developed in capital of Korea, in Seoul. So the high compassion, passion for the education as a parent to their children, that make that kind of attitude to send their children to where the most education possibilities opened. So I think that's kind of big part of the.
Very good. Do you think that the heavy emphasis on getting into the best schools in Korea, and the kind of idea of one strike and you're out, if you don't get into the best school, it's really not going to benefit you that much, is that hurting families, you think, from having more children, or how is that impacting young families?
Yeah, I think that is pretty the big part of that. I recently have met a family who immigrated from Korea directly to my town. The reason I have met the mom to greet and welcome her, but I heard the reason they decided to immigrate is that the competition created in their the school environment. So high tension of competition, even in the school, affected negatively for their children. That was so hard for their family who has 3 children. So they decided to move to America. So that is, education is really high, the big area of in that issues.
Very interesting. So we've been shocked by the situation in Japan and Korea and other parts of the world where they cannot have the proper labor force to even begin to address their labor requirements. So now immigration has become a big issue in Korea and Japan. And Mr. Stone, what are your thoughts about China having the one-child policy? What's the impact of that now? Are they now reversing their policies, and are they? I've read some things about this. I'd like to hear your opinion on that.
China is reversing their one-child policy, and they're reversing it in several different ways. They're reversing it for the Han Chinese by allowing them to have larger families. But the one-child policy always had exemptions for certain groups of people, most notably ethnic minorities. And now China is, while they are allowing Han Chinese to have more children, they are cracking down on childbearing among ethnic minorities, such as the Uyghurs in Western China. This is unfortunate for China because the ethnic minorities have the highest fertility desires. So they are cracking down on the people who would actually have babies if the government wanted them to. China has a similar problem. I actually really want to touch on something Dr. Park said about competitiveness. This is actually one of the root problems in many Asian countries, in Hong Kong, in Taiwan, in Japan. What these countries have in common is not that they're Asian. It's not even necessarily Buddhism or Confucianism or their geography or something like that. What they have in common is their somebody in another question said their one strike system, their hyper competitive educational and workplace norms. That, I mean, my wife and I taught at a school in Hong Kong, and kids knew each other's test scores publicly. Like they knew how everyone did. They knew everybody's rank, and it was very public, and it was made public so that kids would be motivated to get better scores. And to me as an American, that was just like, it's very uncomfortable. And also it makes childhood very different. Childhood becomes this extraordinarily stressful experience of school and after school tutors and then extensive homework at home. And also your parents are working 60-hour work weeks, or at least your father is. Maybe your mother's not, but maybe she'd like to be working, but she can't because working would require her to work 60 hours. Like, it's a situation where the hyper competitive sort of tournament style rewards where everyone's competing and only one person gets the reward, just makes for a lot of extremely high stakes at every step of the life ladder. And that in turn means the price of failure is extraordinarily high. Now, there are different ways to address that. One is you can have a more generous social safety net, like a lot of the Nordic countries do. Another way is you can just try and address the competition at the front end. US schools tend to be far less competitive than Asian schools. And this is something, stereotypically people think of like cooperative Asian societies and like individualist competitive Western societies, but it's totally backwards in our educational systems. Western educational systems tend to be very non-competitive for the kids. We kind of try and squelch the competition. We don't want the kids to be setting up pecking orders of who's smarter than who. Whereas you see a lot of competition in the early career and educational stages in the highly industrialized East Asian countries. And this has really deleterious impacts. And I should note there is an Asian country, a Buddhist majority country, that does not have this educational norm. And they're poorer, but even compared to their income level, they have astonishingly high fertility. And that's Mongolia. And it's because they have a deeply cooperative norm in most of their society that was then reinforced by communist rule, frankly. The key thing to understand here is norms around creating a hyper-competitive, sort of cutthroat society, particularly for children, are really important for fertility, but they're also important for something else, and that is economic growth. These norms exist because they were really useful for what are called developmentalist states. Extremely rapid economic development by getting everyone educated really fast, pushing everyone to work really hard. It works very well for economic growth. The problem is it is economic growth at the price of the families of those workers and ultimately the future of the country.
Very, very interesting. So, Lyman, how many industrialized nations have a birth rate that's sustainable? Are there a few more besides France? Or?
Well, France is below what they would need to be for stable population as well.
So they're still below.
There are the only industrialized nations I know of that are above replacement rate, just off the top of my head. I'm sure there's others, but the ones that I know of off the top of my head are Israel and Georgia.
And what has Israel done to do that, to make that work?
They have really generous financial incentives. But then they also have a similar situation as Georgia, where it's not that one leader says have babies, but it's that the whole national culture communicates to people in Israel, if we don't have a lot of babies, we're going to be exterminated as a people. that
Wait,
sense.
really?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, that sense that that the nation needs you to do this, that your neighbor needs you to do this, that we're all doing this together. That if you have another child and it makes it harder for you to be as competitive at work, it's not going to hurt you because everyone else is doing the same thing. Everyone is making themselves less competitive at work by having their third child, right? So social norms matter. When everyone is having a third child, no one loses in their career advancement by having a third child. But when everyone's only having one child, going for three, you lose. So social norms matter. There's a coordination problem.
Very good. Ms. Pak, how about your faith community? And also, have you seen that the Catholic Church, the Roman Catholic, which is traditionally emphasizing more children, are they showing a higher birth rate? And also other faith communities, is there a high birth rate in Korea among the faith communities, in addition to your own? Or you're muted.
So as far as I know, since it's been a while, I left Korea, but some of my sisters are Catholic religious, and then that doesn't make that religious like differences. They don't make big differences of birth rate they generate in Korea currently. So I think that is society system issues, and in that system, everybody, Catholic, Buddhist, they don't like much of the kind of faith to give birth many. They still want their children to be the best, push them into the competition, and believe that the way is kind of like sacrifice as a parent to make them to be better. So I don't think there is a much differences religion to religion in terms of raising the birth rate.
We have a comment here from Mr. Dan Hess. I can't help but think that we have hardly even begun to face this problem as a global culture, because most people still think that the overpopulation and climate change are the biggest threats, due in part to cultural messaging, and haven't even realized that the pendulum has swung hard toward population collapse. Elon Musk's pronouncements on Twitter recently are the first time most people even heard of this problem. I have to agree with this. This is really, I didn't even know how severe it was. I did notice it a few years ago in Korea, because I've been to Korea many times, and I noticed that all of a sudden they didn't have enough student population for the universities. So they had to start picking which universities they were going to close down. And so why, Lyman, why this giant fear that was created globally about the population explosion and that how severe it's going to be? And yet, I just read last week from one of our programs, it caused me to do a little study, that the United States alone could feed almost 14 billion people a year without even increasing its farmland if it went to massive production of food. So why the population explosion fear? Is the population exploding around the world in other nations that are not industrialized? Why was this brought around where it seemed like it was also benefiting the earth to have less children?
So I just want to start with just there's sort of a funny thing here where Korea does not have enough students to fill its universities. So they're having to close some universities. But one of the problems that many young Korean people will identify is that it's really hard to get a spot at university. The share of Koreans who go to university is not 100%. Mm-hmm. Another option the government could do is not close universities and just increase their spending on enabling more people to fill those spots, or allowing more students to immigrate from other countries to attend. There are other solutions here that the government is choosing not to do because they just value the idea that university should be prestigious and competitive. There need to be losers, right? This is important to government. that there'd be losers in society. So that's sort of a side note.
Yes, good.
As far as population bomb, population was growing very rapidly in the middle of the 20th century. It wasn't clear how that problem would be addressed. Agricultural innovation basically addressed it. Today, starvation and food shortage is rarer than at any time in the past. And that's likely to continue to be more and more true in the future. Growing demand for meat and livestock is creating a lot of various strains on land and other resources. But at the same time, we're innovating in rapid. It's only going to be a few more years before we're going to have lab-grown meat that you're not going to be able to tell the difference. And that'll relieve those pressures. Environmental change is a serious issue. Climate change is a serious issue. Human contributions to it are deeply concerning. Human contributions to it have nothing to do with population. There is zero empirical evidence. There's a lot of theorization, but there's zero empirical evidence that countries that implement stricter population policies have slower growth in carbon emissions. We can look at a great example of this. China's one-child policy, one of the most draconian population policies in history. Did China have slow growth in emissions in the last 50 years?
Not at all. Right.
No, they did not. And in fact, you can make an argument that their emissions grew faster than they would have. Why? One child didn't actually reduce fertility that much, but to the extent that it did, the amount of income that was available was similar. One child didn't mean that there was less investment in China. And what drove carbon emissions was investment in China, relocating factories there for those workers. The workers then had income and they were going to spend it on something. If they had children, they would have spent it on education and childcare, which are basically zero carbon. But since they didn't have children, they spent it on consumption goods, housing, automobiles. These are much more high carbon usages. In general, for a fixed budget constraint of a household, the stuff that children need is lower carbon per dollar that you spend than the stuff that adults would spend on if you didn't have children. Why? Because if you don't have children, you spend a lot on vacations, and vacations are wildly high carbon. If you do have kids, turns out you spend less on airplane tickets and more on diapers. And I'm telling you, you see these things about, the carbon footprint of children, and it's all lies. Like I cannot emphasize how much it is it's not even ambiguous. Like it's just scientific malpractice. These papers that come out about the carbon legacy of children, it's just made up. When you actually look under the surface at the math that they're showing, it is farcical. They assume that adding more children, that if a family has another child, that it increases their income proportionally. Is that how it works? When you have kids, did your income go up proportionally? No, it does not. It goes down often because often one spouse reduces their work. And if you have less income, you have less consumption. If you have less consumption, you have less carbon emissions. So this climate change is important. Population has nothing to do with climate change. We can manage climate change with 20 billion people or with 2 billion.
Thank you so much, Lyman. And Ms. Pak, thank you for having 4 children. So I want to thank you for that. And also, did your Roman Catholic sisters, did they have children? And
yes, they do. I have 2 sisters, and both families have 2 of each.
Oh, okay.
And also, I think in our movement, the members living in Korea, they contributed and they do a lot of contributions to like maintaining the population birth rate. So.
Well, this is absolutely urgent and so important, such an important topic. And Lyman, final question is, how did you choose this field for your career? I know you're getting your PhD soon, and how did you step into this field? What caused you to take on this global, very, very urgent situation?
It was quite by accident. I was writing about regional economic development and started to dabble in population and found that there was a lot of demand for better research on population and policy work on it. And it was interesting. It was consistent with my values. And you know, everybody's got a mortgage, and talking about babies would pay mine. So I'd love to say that, like, from a young age, I was passionate about fertility, but no, I mean, I stumbled into it and found that I enjoyed it, that it was a chance to advocate for something good in the world, and that also it would provide for my rapidly growing family. So.
Well, we can't thank you both enough. We'll be inviting you back, and you're both it's very interesting, but very, very, very crucial issue for our nations and the world. And Lyman, you're very well respected, I have to say, throughout this field globally. And Ms. Pak, thank you for giving your medical career towards this area of solving the problem of disease. And we really need to have more children. So we're going to find some popular celebrities, some great leaders of our nations, and get some of these government policies like France. I think we're going to have to change our ways here. Dr. Berg, it's great you chose to enlighten us on this topic. I want to thank you sincerely for leading the International Association of Academicians for Peace. We couldn't have a better program. It's crucial for our focus of peace in Northeast Asia also. Thank you very much. Go ahead, Dr. Berg. I'll turn it back over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Jenkins, Ms. Park, Lyman Stone. You know, this is a classic, in a sense, classic education point for delayed gratification. You know, you don't see the results of not having kids until, let's say, 20 years later, when things don't work. So there aren't many people who think ahead. So thank you for being two people who think ahead. And let's work together to make this world a better place for our children and grandchildren. And thank you all, you who are in the audience, for participating in this very interesting topic. How can we make this a better place? Or is it going to be like the apocalyptic or dystopian future that we see so much in the movies, where there are just machines going all over the place without human beings, or hiding in the bunkers and this and that? You know, that is not my vision of the future. It's full of children, and happy children with happy parents. So anyway, that's that's who I am, and I thank you for joining us. So let's chat more, and I apologize for not being able to get to all the great questions in the chat, but we'll take note, and maybe we can even talk more about this. So see you soon again, and thank you for logging in. We have Tuesday at the same time next week. There'll be another program of the situation in Korea, not on the population situation per se, but some issues, because Korea, North and South Korea, is a very interesting country, or population, I would say, now officially 2 countries, but still, it's a very interesting, like a microcosm of the problems and successes of the world. So if we can solve the issues there, maybe we can even solve them in the world. So thank you very much. God bless you. Let's meet again soon. Thank you.